So just to recap what has happened in the last several years, Athens and Macedon had been at war since 356 BC. The initial cause of the war was Philip's capture of several Athenian colonies. Shortly after this, the Third Sacred War began after the Phocian capture of the Temple of Apollo in Delphi. Athens allied with Phocis against other members of the Amphictyonic League. During the course of the war, Thessalians were defeated by the Phocians. Thessaly then requested Philip's assistance. Philip agreed, which brought Macedon into the Sacred War, which is probably just the excuse he had been looking for. If we look at the expansion of Macedon during this time period, it's almost directly related to the Greek city-states disputes amongst each other. It was Philip's diplomatic and military genius that exploited this situation. In fact, there is no doubt that in the absence of fighting, Philip was using diplomacy to keep all the major states of Greece divided so that Greece did not form a grand alliance against him. Given all the previous grievances going back many centuries, that was not a difficult task to accomplish. We might look at Greece during this time period as the worst version of Game of Thrones, except Philip was about 5 steps ahead of everyone else. In any event, in 352 BC, the Chalcidian League, led by Olynthos, sought to ally themselves with Athens in order to put a check on Philip's growing influence. This was a breach of their previous alliance with Macedon. Philip attacked the League in 349 BC, and by 348 BC had achieved total victory. As punishment, the Macedonians razed Olynthos. The wholesale destruction of Olynthos terrified the Athenians, who realized they might be next if Philip was able to move his army south. The key to the Athenian strategy to contain Philip was to occupy the pass at Thermopylae, and so the Athenians and Spartans combined forces to block Thermopylae to prevent Philip from moving south. But in a bizarre move, Phocis eventually banned the Athenians and Spartans from defending Thermopylae. After this, Athens decided to seek peace with Philip. So peace was finally attained in 346 BC, but it was an extremely tenuous one at best. Philip's main rival in Athens, Demosthenes, had helped finalize the treaty. But as the ink was still drying on the agreement, Demosthenes regretted it. And for good reason, because Philip was still acting suspiciously. The Macedonians still sent units into the pass at Thermopylae, which meant Philip could threaten central and southern Greece anytime he pleased. With a break in the fighting, Philip decided to shore up the territory and cities he had seized in the north. In 345 BC, he invaded Illyria. Diodorus writes, quote, "In Macedonia, Philip had inherited from his father a quarrel with the Illyrians, and found no means of reconciling the disagreement. He therefore invaded Illyria with a large force, devastated the countryside, captured many towns, and returned to Macedonia laden with booty." End quote. Justin writes he also tried to increase the population of Macedon. This provided more security and also boosted the economy. Quote, "On his return to his kingdom, as shepherds drive their flocks sometimes into winter, sometimes into summer pastures, so he transplanted people and cities here and there, according to his whim, as places appeared to him to be peopled or left desolate. Some people he planted upon the frontiers of his kingdom to oppose his enemies, others he settled at the extremities of it. Some, whom he had taken prisoners in war, he distributed among certain cities to fill up the number of inhabitants, and thus out of various tribes and nations he formed one kingdom and people." End quote. Still, his kingdom was not without issues. In 344 BC, Thessaly began to resent Macedon's influence. To put Thessaly firmly back in his grip, Philip marched his army into the region, ousting any leader or group that opposed him. In addition to reducing Athens' power, he also wanted to constrain the Spartans. Through diplomacy, he succeeded in detaching almost all of the city-states in the Peloponnesus from Sparta. They acted as a buffer against any future Spartan aggression. As a result, in 344 BC, Demosthenes traveled to the Peloponnesus. His goal was to detach as many cities as he could from Macedon's growing influence, but his efforts were largely unsuccessful. Many of these cities were still suspicious of Athens and saw Philip as the lesser of two evils. Once again, using diplomacy, Philip tried to counter the influence of Demosthenes by sending his own orator to Athens in 344 BC. He wanted to defend Macedon against the attacks of the Athenian war party. He also wanted to amend the peace treaty, which for the moment only involved Athens and Macedon. Now he wanted all the Greek city-states to join in on the fun. In response to this, Demosthenes delivered his second Philippic in 343 BC. It was a vehement attack against Philip and his supporters in Athens. Here is the first part. Quote, "In the first place, Athenians, if anyone views with confidence the present power of Philip and the extent of his dominions, if anyone imagines that all this presents no danger to our city, and that you are not the object of his preparations, I must express my astonishment, and beg you all alike to listen to a brief statement of the considerations that have led me to form the opposite conclusion and to regard Philip as our enemy." End quote. Demosthenes slowly but surely turned the opinion in Athens against Philip and his Athenian supporters. Even Philocrates, who the peace treaty was named after, saw that his policy was mostly unpopular. Facing prosecution and a potential death sentence, he voluntarily went into exile in 343 BC. Between 342 and 340 BC, Philip campaigned in Thrace. Thrace was a massive area that was full of ferocious tribes that were a constant threat to Macedonia. Although Philip had considerable influence over western Thrace, he now wanted to move deep into the interior and reduce eastern Thrace. Philip's motives were not all about expansion. He was also concerned that Thrace had recently become too friendly with Athens. Diodorus writes, quote, "Cersobleptes, who was the king of the Thracians, had been following a policy of reducing the Greek cities bordering on Philip's territory. With the aim of putting a stop to the barbarian attacks, Philip moved against them with a large force. He overcame the Thracians in several battles, and imposed on the conquered barbarians the payment of a tax to the Macedonians, and by founding strong cities at key places, made it impossible for the Thracians to commit any outrages in the future." End quote. The king of Thrace was eventually compelled to surrender. The total victory in Thrace brought Macedon an immense amount of wealth, and as usual, Philip spent most of his energy consolidating his control over Thrace through garrisons and governors. Also, he never shied away from including foreign elements into his army. He eagerly incorporated Thracian units into his growing army. The total capture of Thrace would also provide a nice buffer against any future threat from the Persians, whom Philip had a permanent distrust of. It was around this time that Philip became involved with the Scythians. Since his army was already in eastern Thrace, he made several opportunistic raids into these wild and mostly unknown lands. Justin writes, quote, "He made an expedition to Scythia to get plunder so that he might make up for the expenses of one war by the profits of another. The king of the Scythians at the time was Aetius, who, being distressed by a war with the Istrians, sought aid from Philip on the understanding that he would adopt him as his successor on the throne of Scythia." End quote. How could Philip reject such an offer? Taking land without a fight is always the preferred method. But in a turn of events, the king of the Istrians died, and the Scythians no longer needed Philip. Aetius then dispatched a message to Philip, saying he no longer desired his assistance, or an heir, as he already had a son. Philip understood this to some degree, but requested the king pay for some of the expenses of his soldiers that he had already dispatched to assist Aetius. Justin writes, quote, "Aetius, alluding to the rigor of their climate and the barrenness of their soil, which far from enriching the Scythians with wealth, scarcely afforded them sustenance, replied that he had no treasury to satisfy so great a king, and that he thought it more honorable to refuse altogether than to do so little." End quote. Philip felt Aetius was mocking him, and decided to return the favor. He dispatched a message to Aetius, indicating he wanted to build a statue of Hercules. Aetius replied that he had no problem ripping it down once the Macedonians had departed his territory. Justin writes, quote, "With feelings thus irritated on both sides, a battle was fought. Though the Scythians were superior in courage and numbers, they were defeated by the subtlety of Philip. 20,000 young men and women were taken, and a vast number of cattle, but no gold or silver. This was the first proof of the poverty of Scythia. 20,000 fine mares were sent into Macedonia to raise a breed." End quote. Soon the peace completely broke down with Athens, and we will get to that in the next video.